Castle toilets could kill you with a fall. Imagine a castle at dawn. Gray stone towers looming above the mist. Walls slick with cold. Every footstep echoing on flagstones worn by centuries of fear and power. Inside, nobles and servants alike awoke not to luxury, but to a constant gnawing sense of danger. In this world, even the most mundane moments, like answering nature's call, could become a brush with death. Because the medieval castle toilet, the garderobe, was not just uncomfortable. It was an architectural trap, a silent killer lurking in the shadows of daily life. The garderobe was a simple, brutal solution to an unavoidable problem. How do you deal with waste in a stone fortress built to withstand sieges, cut off from the safety and hygiene of city life? The answer was ingenious and reckless. Carved into the thick walls, or sometimes protruding above the moat, guardrobes were little stone chambers, each one with a seat and a hole. Nothing between you and the drop below, but a thin slab of ancient masonry, slick with condensation and sometimes worse. In some castles, the seat hung precariously above a pit that stretched 3 or 4 stories straight down, ending in a heap of refuse or a field of jagged rock. In others, the shaft led out over open air, emptying waste into the moat, or worse, down the outer walls. It was dark, it was freezing, and it was always dangerous. Imagine the feel of the stones under your feet, worn smooth, slippery with centuries of rain and unmentionable filth. There was no railing, no privacy, often not even a door. In winter, the stone itself was so cold it could shock the breath from your lungs. A single misstep, one moment of distraction or a gust of wind through an open slit, and you could lose your balance. There were no safety nets in the Age of Kings. You fell. You plummeted, helpless, down a vertical tunnel of misery and muck, bones snapping against the walls, screams muffled by the stone and the filth below. People died this way. Sometimes it was the smallest mistake. A child leaning too far forward, a servant rushing through chores, a noble's foot slipping as they tried to adjust their heavy robes. There are records of bodies found at the bottom of garderobe shafts, limbs twisted, faces frozen in agony. Death could come instantly on the rocks, or slowly, trapped in waste, unable to climb out. Even survival was a curse. Infection was almost certain. The stench was so overpowering that castle doctors believed it carried disease straight into the lungs. To fall into a garderobe pit was to vanish from the world, your fate a cautionary tale told in horrified whispers. But the dangers did not end with falling. Guardrobes were weak points in the fortress's defense. Invaders sometimes tried to infiltrate castles by climbing up through the filth, risking suffocation, drowning, or capture just to breach the walls. Guards were posted near the most vulnerable guardrobes, and some shafts were fitted with iron bars, not to keep people in, but to keep enemies out. Yet these same defenses could prove fatal to the unwary. A rusted bar might snap without warning. A poorly fitted slab could tilt under your weight. Every trip to the toilet was a gamble, a brief moment when even the highest lord was made as vulnerable as the lowliest stable boy. The risks were not always accidental. Poisonings were common in the ruthless world of castle politics. Some believed that guardrobes were cursed, or that vengeful spirits waited in the darkness to pull the unwary to their deaths. Stories spread of assassins lurking below, or enemies slipping poison gas up through the shaft to kill those sitting above. Whether these stories were true or not, they added a layer of terror to every visit, turning a daily necessity into a ritual of dread. Yet for all their dangers, guardrobes were essential. They were a mark of status, proof that you lived in a fortress so grand it needed its own system of waste disposal. Some castles had elaborate systems, with multiple guardrobes stacked, one above the other, each with its own deadly drop. Others made do with a single stone seat, perched above a pit that no one dared clean except under cover of night. The stench rose through the walls, seeped into the tapestries, clung to the very air. And everyone, from king to scullion, knew the risk. Survival in a castle was a constant negotiation with danger. Disease was everywhere, but the garderobe was its own brand of threat. Visible, physical, inescapable. It was a reminder that beneath the luxury of stone walls and stained glass, life was always fragile, always one mistake away from disaster. Children were warned from an early age to watch their step, to hold tight to the stone, to never ever go alone if they could help it. Superstition flourished. Some nobles carried charms or recited prayers before using the garderobe, seeking protection from a fate that seemed both ridiculous and horrifying. History remembers the great feasts, the battles, the pageantry of medieval castles. But it forgets the fear that crept into the most private moments, the knowledge that every day, every trip to the toilet might be your last. There are stories, half lost to time, of lords who vanished, of servants who fell and were never seen again, of cleaning boys found broken at the bottom of the shaft, the victim of a slip no one witnessed and no one could prevent. The garderobe is more than a curiosity of medieval life. It is a symbol of how even the highest walls could not shield you from the randomness of fate. In a world where life and death were separated by inches of slippery stone, every step was a gamble, every routine moment a potential disaster. The castle toilet could kill you with a fall, and in that simple, brutal truth lies the reality of medieval existence. Safety was always an illusion, and even the most ordinary act could be your undoing. Sieges starved castle dwellers into cannibalism. Picture a stone fortress silhouetted against a leaden sky, its high walls promising safety and power. Inside, the air is thick with the breath of too many bodies, the acrid sting of burning torches, and the hush of unspoken dread. For those trapped within a besieged castle, the outside world shrank to the width of a wall and the depth of a well. Once there was plenty. Meat turning on spits, bread warm from the oven, laughter echoing in the halls. But now the gates are barred and armies circle like wolves, and every day the shelves grow emptier. In the brutal arithmetic of siege warfare, time is the deadliest weapon. The hope of rescue fades and hunger becomes an enemy more relentless than any sword. At first, the siege is a contest of nerves and faith. The defenders watch from the battlements as the enemy camps below, counting banners and torches, measuring the strength of their own resolve against the patience of those who would starve them out. Food is rationed with strict discipline. Salted pork, dried beans, hard cheese. Everything that can be stored is counted, measured, guarded. Water, drawn from ancient wells or caught in rain barrels, is more precious than gold. Children grow quiet. The laughter of feasts becomes a memory. Still, hope persists. Maybe relief will come, maybe the attackers will break off. The first weeks pass in anxious routine. But as days stretch into weeks, the anxiety mutates into fear. The first to suffer are the poor, the servants, the nameless laborers who dwell in the lower halls and sleep by the kitchen fire. Their rations thin to nothing while the lords and soldiers cling to what remains. Next, the horses are slaughtered. Beasts once prized for war or work, now reduced to thin soup and leathery meat. Dogs and cats vanish. Even rats become prey, hunted through the night for scraps of flesh. Hunger breaks down the boundaries of pride and civility. Soon illness follows. Weakened by hunger, the defenders fall sick. Dysentery, fever, the wasting of bodies that can no longer resist. The dead pile up in dark corners. Sometimes there is no energy to bury them. The siege becomes a world of shadows, silent, desperate, smelling of rot and fear. But the most terrible truth lurks at the edge of endurance. There are chronicles whispered by survivors and written with trembling hands by monks of sieges where all food was gone and madness took hold. Mothers watched their children starve, old men wept in shame, and the living began to eye the dead with hollow eyes. What was unthinkable became possible. The chronicles of medieval Europe, from Ma'arat al-Numan during the Crusades to the siege of Rochester, or The Nightmare at Harlech Castle. Record acts of desperation so dark they were rarely spoken aloud. Corpses, once wrapped for burial, became the last forbidden sustenance. There are tales, often deliberately vague, half swallowed by time, of flesh cut from bodies and boiled in secret, of people vanishing into the night, of bones gnawed clean. The shame of cannibalism haunted survivors for generations. It was not simply a crime or a sin, it was the annihilation of everything that made them human. And yet, the siege was the ultimate test of survival, an environment where mercy dissolved and the mind's last defenses crumbled. The decision to eat the dead was never made lightly. It was a slow descent, each stage marked by grief and horror, until hunger itself became a kind of madness, silencing every voice but the body's demand to live one more day. Outside, the besieging armies understood this. They used starvation as a weapon not only to kill, but to break spirits. It was a victory that left scars, not only on the land, but in the souls of those who endured. When the gates finally fell, or when rescue came, the survivors emerged pale, skeletal, shamed. Some castles became haunted places, remembered not for their battles, but for what desperation had forced upon them. History remembers the glory of sieges, the bravery of defenders, the cunning of attackers. But behind every chronicle of victory or defeat is this other story, of ordinary people forced into impossible choices where hunger eroded the very boundaries of civilization. The world inside those stone walls became a crucible, burning away illusions of honor, revealing what it means to survive at any cost. The silence that followed was filled with the memory of what had been lost, not just lives, but innocence, and the certainty that some lines could never be crossed, until they were. Boiling oil and stones were a daily threat from above. Imagine yourself in the suffocating darkness, beneath a stone fortress wall, the air thick with fear and sweat, the roar of battle echoing above. All around you is chaos, the crash of battering rams, the shrill whistle of arrows, the frantic shouts of men who know that at any moment death might rain from the sky. Because above you, unseen defenders stalk the ramparts, eyes trained on every move you make, hands ready to unleash agony and ruin at a single command. This is not just war. This is survival at its rawest. And the threat is not merely swords or arrows, but a nightmare that falls from the heavens, boiling oil, scalding tar, and jagged stones, unleashed with pitiless calculation through murder holes. In the world of medieval siege warfare, castles were more than mere walls. They were engineered death traps, designed not just to repel, but to destroy those who dared attack. From the moment an enemy army appeared at the gates, defenders transformed their home into a fortress bristling with hidden dangers. The most dreaded of these were the murder holes, narrow, carefully placed openings above gateways, passageways, or choke points where defenders could strike at invaders without ever showing their faces. To step beneath a murder hole was to gamble with your life, for what came next could mean instant, agonizing death. Boiling oil is perhaps the most infamous weapon in this arsenal, though history is more complicated than legend. In truth, oil was expensive, rarely wasted on common attackers. But scalding water, quicklime, molten pitch, and even animal fat were all fair game. Imagine advancing with your comrades, the promise of glory driving you forward, only to hear a sudden hiss, a shriek, as a rain of boiling liquid crashes down, burning through armor, cloth, and flesh in seconds. There is no defense, no hope. The pain is total, blinding, inescapable, the kind that makes even the bravest soldier drop his weapon and scream. Just as terrifying were the stones, massive, rough-edged projectiles hurled or dropped from above, targeting anyone foolish enough to crowd beneath the walls. In the chaos of battle, the gatehouse became a deadly funnel. Defenders watched, waiting for the perfect moment, then let loose a hail of rocks, bricks, and debris. The impact was immediate and brutal. A helmet split, a limb crushed, a skull shattered, the air filled with the dull thud of stone meeting bone, the sudden silence as another attacker crumpled to the blood-soaked earth. Tar and pitch added another layer of horror. Unlike oil or water, these substances stuck to the skin, burning as they clung, impossible to shake off. Some defenders would even ignite the tar as it fell, sending flaming rivers cascading onto the attackers below. The smell of burning flesh, the panic of men as fire crawled over armor and clothing, was enough to break the nerve of entire battalions. The psychological effect was almost as powerful as the physical wounds. After one or two attacks, every soldier learned to dread the murder holes, hesitating at every step, knowing that a single miscalculation could end them in an instant. These tactics were not random, they were the result of centuries of innovation in defensive warfare. Medieval engineers designed castles with elaborate layers of defense, each one built to force attackers into bottlenecks and expose them to as much danger as possible. Gatehouses were long and narrow, often with multiple doors or portcullises, each one a potential trap. Above every entrance, murder holes awaited. Defenders could watch, listen, and strike with terrifying precision. Some castles even had hidden trapdoors or concealed passageways, allowing defenders to move unseen and strike where least expected. For the besieged, these weapons were not just practical, they were psychological warfare. Word would spread among the attacking army about the horrors awaiting anyone who tried the gate. Stories circulated about men scalded alive, about comrades crushed without warning, about entire assault teams vanishing in clouds of steam and stone dust. The fear was infectious, slowing every advance, sapping morale, and sometimes turning victory into rout before the battle had even begun. But for the defenders, the murder holes and boiling oil were last resorts, used only when survival hung in the balance. Inside the walls, life was no less fraught. Women and children might be pressed into service, carrying stones or buckets of water, working alongside soldiers in desperate silence. Every sound from outside, a ram striking the gate, the crackle of fire, could mean that the next moment would bring the fight to their doorstep. The defenders knew that mercy was not guaranteed if the walls were breached. Every drop of oil, every stone was hurled with the knowledge that this was a fight not just for victory, but for life itself. Over centuries, these brutal tactics became legend, tales told around fires and whispered by those who had seen the carnage firsthand. Some believed the boiling oil was a myth, a story invented to terrify. But the truth was worse. Whether it was water, pitch, quicklime, or stone, the result was the same. Death from above was a constant reality. One mistake, one unlucky step, and a life was ended in an instant, crushed, scalded, or burned, without mercy or warning. Even now, if you walk through the ruins of an ancient castle, you might see the narrow slits above the gate, the murder holes that once spelled doom for so many. They stand as silent reminders of a world where survival meant mastering the art of terror, where the sky itself could turn deadly, and where courage was measured not just by facing the enemy before you, but by braving the unseen threats that waited overhead. This is the hidden history of medieval siege warfare. The brutal, ingenious, and utterly relentless battle for survival, waged not just with sword and shield, but with every weapon the defenders could hurl from above. For those beneath the walls, every shadow was a warning, every sound a threat. And for the ones who survived, the memory of boiling oil and falling stones would haunt them long after the battle's end. Castles caught fire far more often than you think. When you picture a medieval castle, you imagine thick stone walls, soaring towers, a fortress meant to withstand any attack. But what most people forget is that inside those cold stone shells, castles were tinderboxes, fragile, flammable, always one mistake away from disaster. Throughout the Middle Ages, castles didn't just fall to enemy armies or betrayals. They were undone again and again by the simplest, most relentless threat, fire. The very design that made castles so imposing from the outside hid their vulnerability. Stone might shield against arrows and battering rams, but it was just the skeleton. The heart and muscle of a castle. The beams, floors, roofs, ceilings, staircases were almost always wood. Even the grand halls where lords feasted, the private chambers of queens and princes, the twisting stairwells, the watchtowers high above. These were all lattices of timber, often dried and aged by years of exposure, ready to catch with a single careless ember. Curtains, tapestries, bedding, and rushes on the floor only added more fuel. But the greatest danger wasn't enemy torches, it was everyday life. In a time before electricity or gas, every meal was cooked over an open flame. Castle kitchens were cauldrons of activity, huge hearths, blazing day and night, spits turning, cauldrons bubbling, servants hurrying through clouds of smoke. In winter, every room needed warmth, so fireplaces blazed in nearly every chamber. Candles and lanterns flickered in every corridor, often left unattended. In the chaos of feasts or war, with servants and guards rushing through stone and wood, it was only a matter of time before someone knocked over a torch or a spark slipped from the grate onto a floor covered in straw. One small fire could become an inferno in minutes. Stone does not burn, but it traps heat and smoke, turning castle interiors into deadly ovens. Flames leapt up wooden stairs, raced through galleries lined with tapestries, exploded through thatched or shingled roofs. Once a fire started, putting it out was almost impossible. Castles had wells and water barrels, but no organized fire brigade. In many cases, the only way to fight the flames was to form a human chain and hope the fire didn't outpace your efforts. Some of the greatest castles in history were reduced to smoldering ruins not by siege engines or treachery, but by an accidental spark. In 1216, Corfe Castle, stronghold of kings and outlaws, suffered catastrophic fire during a siege. Its defenders nearly roasted alive. Windsor Castle, the great royal residence, burned repeatedly over the centuries, each time from kitchens or careless servants. In Scotland, Urquhart Castle, perched above Loch Ness, was gutted by fire more than once, finally left a hollowed shell. Even mighty Chateau Gallard, fortress of Richard the Lionheart, burned so fiercely in one attack that stone blocks cracked from the heat. Castles could never be made truly safe from fire. Lords and architects tried, building kitchen blocks separate from living quarters, encasing hearths in brick, banning open candles from upper floors. Some castles had stone-vaulted ceilings in their great halls, a fortune to construct, but the only real defense against a roof blazing overhead. Even so, fire was always a whisper away. Many castles ended their lives not as proud ruins, but as blackened husks, abandoned after one blaze too many. The psychological impact of fire haunted castle life. Lords and ladies slept uneasy, especially during festivities, storms, or times of unrest. Servants crept through halls at night to check every fire and lantern. In siege, attackers knew the secret. A few burning arrows, or a torch thrown through a window, could be more devastating than any battering ram. And when fire came, it moved with speed and violence no soldier could match, devouring, suffocating, leaving behind only scorched stone and ashes where once there had been laughter, secrets, and life. Castles were built to resist the world's brutality, but their true enemy was something much older and more patient. In the end, the memory of fire outlived even the walls it destroyed. The blackened stones, warped iron, and charred beams that archaeologists uncover today tell the true story, that in the heart of every fortress, no matter how mighty, lived a secret, flickering fear of the very element that gave warmth, light, and life. One spark, one mistake, and everything they'd built, every symbol of power and security, could vanish in a storm of flame. Poisonings were common at the feasting table. Imagine a great medieval hall filled with laughter, shimmering candlelight, and the mouth-watering aroma of roasting meats and fresh-baked bread. Lords and ladies draped in velvet and gold raise jeweled goblets and lean in to share secrets over platters piled high. But beneath this glamour, there's an invisible war. Every mouthful is a gamble. Each shared cup is a test of trust. For in these glittering feasts, poison could be the silent guest that ends dynasties, upends alliances, and leaves only horror in its wake. In a world where medicine was primitive and forensic science non-existent, suspicion was everywhere. Feasts were not just celebrations, but theaters of power, where food and drink became weapons as deadly as any sword. Poisonings were not wild rumors, but brutal reality woven into the fabric of noble life. A single drop, a dusting of powder, a slice of tainted meat. These could decide the future of kingdoms. Even the morning bread, still warm from the oven, might hide a dose of something fatal, administered by a servant with trembling hands, or a kitchen boy bought with a rival's coin. Royal and noble families learned to live in dread. Some appointed tasters, men who would sample every dish before it touched a ruler's lips. But even this was no guarantee. The most sophisticated poisons acted slowly, disguising themselves as common illnesses or taking hours to show their effects. Ambitious wives, jealous cousins, displaced heirs, anyone with a claim or a grudge might conspire to slip a lethal agent into the salt or the wine. In some cases, entire households perished, struck down not by battle, but by a well-placed vial of venom. Kitchens became battlegrounds. To bribe a cook was to wield a hidden dagger, and to turn a trusted servant was to hold life and death in one's palm. Spices and medicines shared the same shelves as toxins: arsenic, hemlock, belladonna, and mercury. The line between healing and harming was paper thin, and the knowledge of how to extract and mix poisons was passed down in whispers, guarded by apothecaries and midwives who could become either saviors or executioners. Sometimes even the most loyal staff could be turned. The promise of gold, freedom, or even simple revenge could make a kitchen maid or stable hand betray their master in a heartbeat. At banquets, guests eyed each other warily. Was that cough across the table a sign of betrayal? Was the wine too sweet, the sauce a little bitter? Men sent secret messages to the kitchens demanding fresh food and untouched bottles. Others feigned illness to avoid meals altogether, knowing that to eat was to risk everything. In some courts, rulers only ate food prepared by their mothers or wives, and even then watched every step with suspicion. The tables that saw deals forged and marriages arranged also became the stages for the slow, silent deaths of kings and queens. The fear of poison changed everything. Meals became rituals of caution, and trust became the rarest delicacy of all. Alliances fell apart not over open war, but over rumors that a goblet had been tampered with. Some lords retreated from public life entirely, living on plain bread and water, locking themselves away rather than risk the hidden death that lurked in the kitchens. Even the act of breaking bread together, once a sacred bond, became a moment of tension, each guest wondering if this meal would be their last. The history books are littered with half-remembered tales: a rival duke who fell dead after a banquet, a queen whose lips turned blue at the feast, a bishop whose heart gave out after sipping his morning ale. Rarely could the poisoner be found. Accusations flew, servants vanished, but the crime itself dissolved into shadow, leaving behind only fear and the endless cycle of suspicion. Even when murder could not be proved, the damage was done. The very act of living in dread was a poison all its own. In the end, the legacy of those poisoned feasting tables was not just the loss of a few rulers, but a permanent scar on the way power was shared, trust was given, and food itself was seen. The glittering banquets of the Middle Ages were haunted by the knowledge that in a single moment, a meal could become a funeral. Every crumb and every sip carried the possibility of betrayal. And so, the kitchen became the true heart of power, a place where the line between life and death was written in flour, salt, and the quiet, deadly patience of those willing to wait for the right moment to strike. Even now, if you wander the ruins of old castles and imagine the clatter of dishes and the hush of servants, you can almost sense the unease that once seeped into every corner. In a world where enemies were everywhere, trust was as fragile and as dangerous as the sharpest knife. The walls were so cold people died from exposure. Within the towering walls of a medieval castle, life was meant to be secure, safe from siege, rebellion, or betrayal. But few stories dwell on the silent killer that stalked those vast stone corridors. The cold. In winter, the very walls meant to protect became a threat all their own. Castles, with their soaring ceilings and fortress-thick masonry, were marvels of defense, but disasters for warmth. The stone, implacable and dense, soaked up the chill and released it slowly, turning every hall into a cavern of icy breath. Outside, the wind howled around the turrets and battlements, but inside, the bite of cold was inescapable, gnawing deeper than any sword. Imagine the long nights of December or January, the sun vanishing early behind black clouds, the world outside covered in rime and frost. Fires crackled in the great halls, but their warmth barely reached beyond a few paces. The vastness of the space devoured heat, and the flames flickered feebly against walls as cold as tombs. In the grandest rooms, tapestries were hung not just for beauty, but to stop the icy drafts that slipped through every crack in the mortar. Reed mats covered stone floors, and heavy curtains shielded doorways, but the winter always found its way in. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. In the sleeping chambers high in the towers, the frost crept in through the arrow slits and under the doors. Beds were islands in a frozen sea, piled with every scrap of wool or fur, yet breath still hung in the air as a ghostly mist. Servants and nobles alike shivered through the night, teeth chattering, muscles cramped from tension and cold. For the fortunate, a bed warmer might take the edge off, or a trusted servant would build up the fire before dawn. But for most there was only endurance. The cold worked slowly, numbing fingers and toes, sapping strength, stealing the will to rise and move. The weakest fell first. Children, the elderly, the ill, anyone whose blood ran a little slower, whose blankets were a little thinner. Servants who slept in drafty corners and unheated chambers near the kitchens or stables sometimes did not wake in the morning. There are quiet records, scattered through the accounts of castle life, of deaths in winter with no violence but the cold itself as culprit. Even the noble and powerful could not always escape. In times of harsh winter, the cold seeped into the very marrow, robbing lords and ladies of breath in the dead of night. Everyday life became a constant battle against exposure. People wore layer upon layer, linen, wool, furs, anything to trap warmth. Meals grew heartier, as much for heat as for hunger. Ale was drunk warm, hands were wrapped around mugs, just to feel a moment's relief. Sleep was huddled, with whole families or servants gathering together for body heat. Still, the cold pressed in. Simple chores like washing or fetching water became agony, as buckets of water froze solid and frostbite nipped at any bare skin. The architecture of castles, so suited to resisting attack, made the fight against cold almost unwinnable. Thick walls took all day to heat, and once cold, stayed cold for weeks. High ceilings and huge chambers allowed warm air to vanish upward. Chimneys, a later luxury, were rare. Smoke hung low, offering a different danger as people huddled closer to smoldering fires, breathing in fumes for the promise of warmth. Even the king's chamber could be a trap, a grand room more suited to a statement of power than to human survival. Death by exposure was a slow, quiet affair, marked by fatigue, confusion, and a growing sense of numbness. In the silence of the castle night, when all the defenses were up and every door was barred, the real danger moved in the shadows and the frost. There are tales, some whispered, some written down in the margins of dusty ledgers, of bodies found frozen in the morning, of servants dying quietly in their sleep, of noble women whose beauty was lost to the cold before their time. Those who survived the winter learned a kind of stubborn resilience. The cold shaped daily life, relationships, even politics. Hospitality in winter was as much about warmth as about food. The threat of freezing became a tool, sometimes a sentence, sometimes a warning. To be sent from the fire was a punishment. To be found outside the walls at night was a death sentence. Today, the ruins of castles still stand, majestic, silent, beautiful. Their stones hold the memory of battles and kings, but also the secret history of winter's slow toll. In every empty chamber and echoing corridor, the chill lingers, a reminder that for all their power, even the greatest fortresses could not keep out the most patient enemy. The cold was the castle's secret curse, a silent danger that claimed lives without ever drawing a sword. In the end, survival was not just a matter of strength or skill, but of outlasting the darkness and praying for the sun to return. Castles were full of deadly staircases and trapdoors. Within the stone walls of a medieval castle, danger was never far from reach, even for those who called it home. Castles were built for defense, not comfort, their design a maze of calculated risk where every step could carry a threat. Among the most deceptively deadly features were the staircases and trapdoors, tools of war that became hazards in everyday life, claiming lives not only in battle, but in the quiet routine of midnight and morning. Imagine the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through narrow corridors. Spiral staircases wound tightly upward inside towers, each step worn smooth by centuries of use, slick from the tread of muddy boots and the dust of uncounted seasons. These stairs were carved with intent, built to curve clockwise, so that right-handed defenders could wield swords freely, while attackers were hemmed in by the central column, forced to fight awkwardly. This ingenious design might slow an enemy, but it was merciless to everyone else. In the darkness, with only a flickering torch or the memory of familiar steps, the castle's own residents risked their necks on those same twisting flights. A servant carrying bread to the hall, a child chasing after a cat, an old lord climbing to bed, one slip was enough. There were no railings, no uniform risers, just uneven stones and the ever-present chill of the tower. Falls were common, and the injuries brutal. Broken legs, shattered skulls, lives ended with a single misstep. In the hush of night, a sudden thud might mean someone would never rise again. Trap doors were another hidden peril. Concealed within floors or beneath rushes, they were devised as desperate tools of defense, ways to drop invaders into pitch-black oubliettes, to funnel attackers into bottlenecks, or to cut off escape when the enemy breached the outer gates. But these clever tricks did not discriminate. Sometimes, in the confusion of an alarm, a loyal guard would vanish through the wrong hatch. Children playing, drunk soldiers, or even the lord of the manor could be caught unawares. Stories survive of servants tumbling into darkness, of attackers plummeting to their doom, of accidents hushed up to avoid scandal. The risks grew worse in winter. Candles guttered in drafts, frost made steps treacherous, and exhaustion dulled senses already battered by fear or wine. The only safety lay in memory, knowing exactly where to place each foot, how many steps until the landing, which board to avoid. But memory could fail, and the castle took no pity. Every corner of a castle held reminders of mortality. The architecture was a weapon, but it also punished those who lived within its grasp. Sometimes the cost of security was paid not by invaders, but by the very families who called these fortresses home. The injuries and deaths went mostly unrecorded, lost in the shadow of greater tragedies, wars, betrayals, sieges. Yet for every lord slain in battle, there were many more maids, children, and knights who simply vanished beneath the stones, claimed by the silent hazards of their own defenses. Over time, legends grew. Staircases were said to be haunted by the spirits of the fallen. Trapdoors became symbols of treachery and fate. The architecture of fear left scars, not just on bodies, but on memory itself. To live in a castle was to live with constant reminders that death could be as close as the next step, waiting, silent, for the moment the world slipped out from beneath your feet. In the grand history of castles, filled with battles and coronations, these quiet, deadly dangers were often ignored. But they shaped the lives of everyone inside, reminders that even the walls meant to protect could sometimes betray, and that every night, behind the grandeur, the castle whispered its own tally of the lost. Heir assassinations often happened inside the castle. The towering walls of a medieval castle were built for protection, but sometimes the greatest threat waited not outside but within. In the world of royalty and high nobility, the line between family and enemy was thin, and the price of power was often paid in blood. For behind those thick stone walls, beyond the great halls and gilded chapels, a darker story played out. The hidden, silent, and often brutal assassinations of heirs, rivals, and even children, carried out by their own kin. From the outside, castles appeared as monuments to stability. Their banners flew high, their guards marched in endless circles, and their walls seemed impenetrable. But step beyond the drawbridge and you'd find a world simmering with suspicion and paranoia, where every corridor hid secrets and every locked door was a reminder that danger was never far. In this world, being born to the throne was a blessing shadowed by a curse, for every rightful heir was also a threat to someone else's ambitions. The night was the true accomplice of these crimes. Royal children, tucked into velvet beds under painted ceilings, became vulnerable the moment candles were snuffed. Sometimes death arrived quietly, a poisoned cup, a slow-acting powder mixed into wine. More often it came with sudden violence, a silent dagger in the dark, footsteps echoing on stone stairs, muffled cries that vanished behind heavy doors. Servants would later whisper that they heard nothing, saw nothing, as another young life disappeared from the royal roll call. The motives were rarely mysterious. In the brutal calculus of succession, one child's life was often all that stood between an ambitious uncle or sibling and the crown itself. The line of inheritance, in theory so clear, was in reality a battlefield. The very rules of medieval monarchy encouraged betrayal, for only the strongest or the most ruthless could hope to survive the shifting tides of court intrigue. A weak heir was a liability, a pawn to be removed. Sometimes the killing was direct and personal. Sometimes it was arranged through a trusted advisor or bribed servant. History remembers the most infamous cases. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, were sent to the Tower of London for their protection by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. They were never seen again. Their fate remains one of England's darkest mysteries, but most believe they were murdered, likely on orders from the very man who would claim their crown. The Tower, once a symbol of royal might, became their tomb, and the world learned that a castle could be as much a prison as a palace. But the story repeated across centuries and kingdoms. In Scotland, the court of James II witnessed the Black Dinner, where young Earl William Douglas was murdered at the king's table, his severed head served on a platter, a chilling warning to all who would challenge royal power. In France, the infamous Valois family turned assassination into an art, with brothers and sons falling to poison, dagger, and outright execution, all under the same roof that had once sheltered them. Even in distant Russia, Ivan the Terrible struck down his own son in a fit of rage, the echo of the blow reverberating through the palace and history alike. No one was immune, not princes, not rival claimants, not even innocents swept up in the storm. Chapels, meant to be sanctuaries, became scenes of sudden violence. Stairwells, usually silent, ran with blood. The very architecture of castles, meant to protect, was twisted to enable these private wars. Secret passages allowed killers to slip unseen, hidden doors led to chambers where conspirators waited, and guards, sworn to loyalty, sometimes turned their backs for a bag of coins. Yet these acts were rarely random. They were cold, calculated, and almost always cloaked in ceremony or silence. Officially, heirs died of fevers, accidents, or melancholy. But rumors spread, and the people knew. Every mysterious death tightened the web of suspicion, feeding an atmosphere where no one could truly trust their kin. Children learned to watch what they said, who they confided in, and to never sleep too soundly. What's most chilling is how ordinary this became. In the world of kings and queens, betrayal was an expected risk of daily life. For every public coronation, there were whispered funerals. For every royal celebration, there was a family in mourning, and a courtier quietly moving closer to the throne. Ambition, once unleashed, cared little for blood ties. love and loyalty were sometimes little more than tools, discarded when inconvenient. These stories were not just about the powerful, they shaped the very kingdoms they ruled. The sudden removal of an heir could send a realm into chaos, civil wars erupted, rival claimants clashed, and ordinary people suffered as the court's violence rippled outward. Some assassins became kings, others paid the price when fortune turned. Yet the castles remained, silent witnesses to countless tragedies, their walls forever echoing with the secrets they were built to contain. If you walk the corridors of an old castle today, you might feel that chill, the sense that something was left unresolved, some story never fully told. The stones remember. They remember the footsteps at midnight, the whispered plots, the quiet gasp in the dark. And they remind us that the true battle for power was often waged not on open fields, but in bedrooms, stairwells, and hidden chambers, by family against family, with the future of an entire kingdom hanging on a single silent act. Dungeon torture happened, just floors below. Dinner. In the world of medieval castles, life unfolded on two levels, one shimmering with feasts, laughter, and power, the other drowned in shadows and suffering. Above, in soaring halls lit by candlelight and filled with music and courtly chatter, lords and ladies dined, danced, and bargained for influence. But just beneath their feet, sometimes separated by nothing more than a few feet of stone, another reality played out. A world of chains, screams, and darkness, where justice was raw and pain was a tool of control. Medieval dungeons weren't hidden far away from the heart of castle life. They were deliberately built close, often directly beneath the main chambers, the kitchens, or even the chapel. These stone-walled torture cells and interrogation rooms were buried in the foundations, sometimes accessible only through trapdoors or winding staircases that twisted away from the bustle of everyday activity. For those above, the horrors happening below were impossible to ignore. Sound travels easily through stone, and the agony of prisoners, shouts, sobs, the dull thud of fists or the crack of whips, rose up like an unholy undertone beneath the civilized rituals of the elite. Imagine the psychological atmosphere of such a place. At night, as noble guests toasted with spiced wine or children slept in small beds, faint wails echoed up through the floors. Servants moving silently in the corridors would pause, a tray trembling in their hands, as muffled shrieks filtered through flagstones. Even the most jaded knight or courtier could not fully tune out the reminders of what waited in the depths. Castle life was haunted by the awareness that every day's peace was underwritten by invisible, ongoing suffering. For the prisoners themselves, the nearness of ordinary life was another torment. To hear laughter, the clinking of goblets, or the far-off melody of a harp while chained in darkness must have been a particular cruelty. Some dungeons were so close to the kitchens that the scent of roasting meat or fresh bread drifted into the fetid air, mocking the condemned with reminders of pleasures forever lost. There are accounts of prisoners forced to listen to banquets directly overhead, the thundering of dancing feet shaking dust from the ceilings, while they waited for another round of interrogation. Torture was not just a punishment, it was theater, warning, and control. Devices like the rack, the strappado, thumbscrews, and the Iron Maiden were employed with brutal efficiency. Jailers dragged captives from cells at all hours, sometimes bringing them up into the very halls where noblemen walked, to serve as public warnings before being thrown back below for the questioning to continue. The line between spectacle and secrecy was razor thin. Sometimes the court above demanded evidence of a confession. Other times the screams themselves were enough, a chilling soundtrack reminding everyone of the price of defiance. This proximity to cruelty had an effect on those who lived above. Children grew up attuned to the sounds of suffering. Ladies embroidered in sunlit chambers, while unease simmered just beneath the surface. Noblemen made political decisions over meals, fully aware that a wrong word or failed alliance could land them in those same cells. Even the servants, forever caught between worlds, absorbed the tension, knowing that to serve in a castle was to exist in a space shaped by fear as much as privilege. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine castles only as symbols of grandeur, strategy, or romance. But under every banner and behind every banquet, the reality was far stranger and more disturbing. The same walls that hosted celebrations trapped the echoes of agony. Stone absorbed every secret and every scream, so that, even at the height of joy or triumph, there was always a chill in the air, a reminder that just a few floors below, the machinery of terror never slept. Living in a castle meant living with the knowledge that peace and pain were never far apart. The feast upstairs was always shadowed by the dungeon below, and everyone, from king to kitchen boy, knew that a single fall from favor could turn the music of the halls into the nightmare of the torture chamber, just steps and yet a whole world away. Castles had hidden priest holes that became death traps. Picture a massive stone castle, torchlight flickering on ancient tapestries, echoing footsteps of armored guards prowling the corridors at midnight. Now imagine the world beneath and behind those walls, a maze of secrets, fear, and silent desperation. This is where the story of the priest hole begins, not as a tale of adventure, but as a living nightmare for those hunted for their faith, who learned that salvation could be as suffocating as the persecution they tried to escape. In the England of Elizabeth I and her successors, Catholicism was outlawed, and to harbor a priest was to sign your own death warrant. Families who clung to the old faith risked everything, their homes, their freedom, their very lives. But in the struggle between conscience and survival, ingenuity became a necessity. Master carpenters like the legendary Nicholas Owen were called to create the most ingenious hiding places in English history. They carved priest holes into the bones of ancient castles and manor houses, beneath staircases, inside chimney stacks, behind false walls, and under floorboards. Each one was a tiny coffin of hope, a chamber barely big enough to crouch in, lined with stone or wood, cloaked in utter darkness. The priest holes were marvels of construction, often so cleverly concealed that even the most brutal searches failed to uncover them. But the price of safety was its own torment. Imagine being sealed away as search parties ripped your home apart, listening to the shouts and boots of pursuivants just inches away, knowing that discovery meant a traitor's death. The air grew thin. Every minute inside was a minute stolen from death, but also from life, light, and sanity. Some priest holes were so cramped that a man could neither stand nor fully lie down, forced into agonizing stillness while hours stretched into days. Sometimes these holes did their job. Guards searched and found nothing, and the hidden priest would crawl out to celebrate Mass in whispered triumph. But often the hiding place became a death trap. There was no escape once the entrance was sealed from the outside, no air, no food or water beyond what little could be smuggled in. If the search lasted too long, the occupant's world shrank to a single, endless night, breath growing shallow, heart pounding, hope draining away. The luckiest might pass out from lack of oxygen. The less fortunate would starve alone in darkness, so absolute it erased the sense of time or even self. For the families who built and guarded these holes, the burden was just as heavy. If a priest's body was ever found in the walls, all would be accused of treason. The courage required to create and use such spaces was matched only by the terror of every knock on the door, every rumor of a new round of searches. Servants were sworn to secrecy. Children taught to lie without flinching. The entire household became accomplices in a deadly game. Some priest holes were only discovered centuries later, when old houses were renovated and workers found skeletons curled in spaces where the air had run out long before rescue could come. The priest hole stands as a testament to the collision of faith and fear, and to the extremes ordinary people will endure when belief is criminalized. The castles and manors of England still keep these secrets, empty spaces in the walls that once held the hopes and prayers of men who knew every Mass could be their last. Today they are little more than architectural curiosities, but if you crawl inside, close your eyes, and listen, You might feel the echoes of breathless prayers and the silent panic of those for whom even sanctuary could become a tomb. The story of the priest hole is not just about hiding, it is about what happens when the walls close in and the world decides that some must disappear for others to feel safe. It is about faith squeezed into darkness, loyalty measured by suffering, and the thin line between safety and suffocation. In every cold stone chamber, the question lingers: what would you risk for what you believe, and what would you endure to keep hope alive when every exit is a trap? The castles that still stand hold within them not just the bones of history, but the ghosts of all those who learned too late that sometimes the price of survival is the slowest, loneliest death of all. Disease spread fast behind closed castle walls. Imagine a castle at the edge of winter, the gates barred, the portcullis lowered, and the world outside silent except for the howl of wind or the distant shouts of an enemy. To those within, the fortress felt invulnerable. Stone walls thick enough to hold back armies, towers high enough to see danger coming for miles. But the most lethal threats did not arrive with banners and siege towers. Sometimes they entered unseen, borne on a servant's breath, a rat's quick feet, or a merchant's bundle. When disease slipped past the defenses, the castle's strength became its greatest weakness. Behind closed walls, sickness became a silent predator, and survival turned into a desperate private war. Castles were designed to be sealed against the world, especially during outbreaks of plague or the chaos of attack. Guards watched the gates, and everyone who entered was scrutinized. But all it took was one: a stable boy with a cough, a kitchen maid with flushed cheeks, a rat in the cellars, to doom the entire population. The very architecture meant to protect now turned the castle into a tomb. Hundreds of people, from lords and ladies to servants and soldiers, lived together in tight quarters. The air grew thick with smoke and breath, the same water drawn and redrawn from ancient wells, food prepared by too many hands. When plague or fever struck, the signs appeared quickly. It began with a cough, a shiver, a rash. In the cramped barracks, fever moved from bed to bed. In the kitchens, illness spread with each loaf of bread. One infected servant could contaminate every dish, every jug of ale. Those tasked with caring for the sick, nurses, mothers, fellow servants, became the next victims. Soon it was everywhere. The disease did not care for rank or title. Lords and ladies, children, and men-at-arms all shared the same risk. Privilege might buy better food or warmer rooms, but the miasma of illness respected no one. The castle became a place of fear. Chills and sweats, the sweet rot of bodies, the panic of not knowing who would be next. These ruled the nights. People avoided each other, whispered prayers, and sometimes blamed one another. The leech or doctor might be summoned, but their knowledge was limited, their remedies sometimes as dangerous as the disease itself. Garlic and vinegar were stuffed in doorways, posies worn at the wrist, windows shuttered tightly in hopes of keeping out the bad air. But nothing helped. The disease was already inside. Isolation became impossible. The very features that made the castle defensible, narrow staircases, sealed doors, shared fireplaces, now worked against the people inside. Fresh air was a memory. Chamber pots overflowed, drains clogged, and the rushes on the floors hid filth that bred even more sickness. Washing was rare, water precious, and superstition ran wild. The desperate tried everything: charms, prayers, ritual cleansings. But as the days passed, beds filled with the dying, and the chapel echoed with funerals. Sometimes attempts at quarantine were made. The sick were moved to distant towers or locked in rooms, but the gesture was often too late. Servants were forced to tend to the dying, sometimes locked inside with them. Fear became its own contagion. Some tried to flee, but to escape the castle was to risk punishment or to spread death beyond the walls. For those trapped inside, the fear of disease was more constant and intimate than the threat of siege. Armies came and went. Sickness crept in and never left. Chronicles from across Europe tell of castles where whole families vanished in a matter of weeks. Children were orphaned, lines of succession snapped, and castles, once alive with feasts and laughter, fell silent but for the sound of coughing and weeping. Even when the worst passed, the scars remained. Survivors bore the marks of plague on their bodies and in their minds. Some castles became notorious for the losses suffered within their walls. The memory of illness haunted every corridor, echoed in the empty rooms, and the stories passed down by survivors. In the end, castles were never as safe as they seemed. Their strength was double-edged. Protection from outside, but vulnerability within. Every sealed window, every bolted gate, made it harder to escape not just armies, but the tiny invaders that brought so much more suffering. Disease, invisible and unstoppable, revealed the limits of stone and power. In its wake, it left behind a lesson as enduring as the castles themselves. Sometimes the greatest danger is not what we keep out, but what we let in, and what we cannot escape once the doors are closed. Kitchens were so hot, cooks dropped dead from heat. Step through the gates of a medieval castle, and you might imagine grandeur, knights in shining armor, elegant banquets, and endless feasts. But behind every glittering dining hall, hidden beneath layers of stone and centuries of dust, lies a world most never saw, the castle kitchens. These were not places of comfort, but of danger, desperation, and deadly heat. For those who worked here, life was a brutal struggle against exhaustion, burns, and a constant suffocating fire that could take your life in a matter of minutes. In the silent records of history, among the stories of kings and battles, lies a tale just as dark. The cooks who dropped dead from heat, lost to the flames that kept the castle alive. The kitchen was the engine room of any great household, and in a castle it was a world unto itself, crowded, frantic, and always perilous. Day and night, the fires never stopped burning. In winter, they were a mercy. In summer, they were a sentence. Massive hearths glowed with open flames, fed with endless cartloads of wood. Rows of spits turned huge carcasses of meat. Cauldrons bubbled with thick boiling stews. Bakers sweated over loaves, rising in primitive ovens where even a moment's inattention could mean disaster. There was no escape from the heat, not for an hour, not for a minute. The air shimmered, thick with smoke, grease, and the tang of burning flesh, both animal and sometimes human. Ventilation was almost non-existent. Castle architects cared more about fortifications than the comfort of the workers. Small, high windows let in slivers of light but trapped the heat. Smoke curled along the ceilings, burning the eyes and throats of everyone below. Cooks wiped sweat from their brows only for it to return in seconds, running in rivers down their faces, soaking their tunics, stinging their wounds. There were no breaks, no fresh air, no place to hide. The only relief was at the edge of collapse. Historical records, sparse but chilling, describe cooks fainting in the middle of their labor, collapsing to the flagstones or into open fires, never to rise again. In some great houses, it became common for kitchen staff to work in shifts so that at least some might survive. But in many castles, the demand for food was relentless. Nobles expected feasts, lavish, endless, and perfectly timed. The labor behind those banquets was invisible to the guests, but all-consuming for the workers. One misstep, one dizzy moment, and a cook might fall forward into the flames, a scream quickly muffled by the roar of the hearth. And then there was the constant threat of burns. Open flames licked at loose sleeves and hems. Boiling oil hissed and spat, ready to scar or blind. Massive iron cauldrons, sometimes so heavy it took 2 or 3 people to lift them, were moved by hand with nothing but damp cloths or rough mitts to offer protection. A spilled pot could mean third-degree burns. A stray spark could ignite a tunic or apron. The cooks learned to work in a strange, coordinated dance, always moving, always watching each other's backs, always aware that the kitchen was as lethal as any battlefield. But it was the heat, relentless and inescapable, that claimed the most lives. Heat stroke, though not yet understood by name, was a constant threat. In the dead of summer, temperatures in the kitchen could soar to unbearable levels. Cooks became dizzy, nauseous, their vision swimming as their bodies tried and failed to cope. The strong might drag themselves outside to gulp at the air. The weak simply collapsed. Sometimes the only warning was silence, a body slumping to the floor while the rest carried on, too busy to notice until it was too late. Those who survived bore the marks, burns old and new, raw throats from breathing smoke, eyes permanently reddened, skin toughened by years of abuse. For many, their reward was little more than a bowl of stew and a pallet in the servants' quarters. There were no monuments for these cooks, no songs or poems in their honor, only the unending labor and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same trial by fire. And yet, despite it all, the kitchens never stopped. The machinery of castle life depended on these invisible workers. They fed not just the lords and ladies, but the entire household. Knights, squires, servants, visiting dignitaries, the endless stream of mouths that depended on the daily miracle of food. To fail was unthinkable. To complain was pointless. The castle's heart was kept beating by those who accepted that the kitchen itself might claim them at any moment. If you listened to the stones in an old castle, you might hear the ghosts of their labor. The echo of ladles scraping iron pots, the hiss of fat on fire, the sudden silence when a cook dropped where he stood. The kitchens, now cold and empty, were once a crucible, merciless and unforgiving. Every feast was bought with sweat, blood, and sometimes lives. The grandeur of the banquet hall was built on the suffering behind the scenes. In the end, the story of the medieval cook is the story of survival against impossible odds, a life lived on the edge of collapse, in service to people who never knew their names. Every plate carried into the great hall was a victory. Every night survived was a small miracle. They were soldiers in an endless, thankless war against the heat, and for too many, the kitchen was the battlefield where they fell. So the next time you see the ruins of a castle or imagine a royal feast, remember the people who stood closest to the flames, who worked until their bodies failed, who died nameless and unremembered in service to the lords of history. The heat that took them was as real as any enemy, and their struggle, though hidden, was every bit as heroic as any knights on the field of battle. Falling masonry, crushed people during repairs. Beneath the stoic grandeur of medieval castles, a quieter, deadlier enemy lurked. Not always swords or sieges, but the very stones themselves. For all their reputation as impenetrable strongholds, castles were in constant battle with time, weather, and gravity. Walls shifted, battlements loosened, and towers leaned. The truth that rarely makes the legends is this: the same stonework that promised safety was always threatening disaster, and every year the toll of falling masonry was paid not just in ruined walls, but in broken bodies, laborers, servants, even the highborn themselves. Castles were feats of medieval engineering, but they were never finished. Every winter, frost cracked the mortar. Every summer, storms battered roofs and parapets. Siege engines and cannon left their scars, but even in times of peace, the slow work of decay continued. The very act of living inside a castle was to live in a building site, a place where scaffolds creaked, stonemasons clambered up ragged walls, and piles of rubble were an everyday sight. Routine repairs were constant. Huge teams of craftsmen hauled up replacement stones, reset heavy lintels, patched towers, and rebuilt collapsed staircases. Yet even the most skilled workers had little protection. Safety harnesses did not exist. Scaffolding was primitive, sometimes just planks lashed together, swaying above sheer drops. A single slip, a misjudged blow from a mallet, or a gust of wind could bring disaster. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds would break free and plummet, striking anyone below without warning. Entire stretches of wall might crumble in a heartbeat, turning an ordinary workday into chaos. It wasn't just the workers who were at risk. Residents moved daily beneath archways and walkways, under towers that were sometimes already shifting or riddled with hidden faults. Servants ran errands up narrow stairs. Cooks carried supplies through echoing corridors. Children played in courtyards littered with loose debris. There are records of entire families crushed when a section of wall gave way without warning. Lords themselves inspecting repairs or showing guests the strength of their stronghold sometimes became victims, reduced in an instant from masters of their domain to casualties of their own ambition. The psychological weight of this constant danger shaped life inside the fortress. Every rumble from above could send a jolt of fear through the halls. The sight of a cracked lintel or crumbling mortar was more than a sign of age. It was a silent threat. Workmen learned to listen for the shifting groans of stone, to leap aside at the sound of falling rubble. But not everyone was lucky, and not every disaster could be predicted. Some collapses were legendary. In 1283, at the mighty Caernarfon Castle in Wales, a section of the curtain wall collapsed during construction, burying dozens of masons and laborers beneath tons of rock. At Château de Chinon in France, centuries of poor repairs left towers so unstable that simply opening a door at the wrong moment could send a shower of deadly debris tumbling down. In castles across Europe, memorials and gravestones marked the spots where the stones claimed their toll. After every accident, the repairs would begin again, new stones hauled up, new walls raised, even as families mourned the latest victims. Some castles developed reputations as cursed, their names whispered by workers who feared the next collapse. Yet life went on. Castles, for all their promise of protection, were as dangerous as they were magnificent. Today, the ruins of these fortresses tell the silent story. Behind every fallen tower or cracked stair lies the memory of a life crushed beneath the weight of history itself. The grandeur of stone castles is undeniable, but so too is the cost, measured not only in gold and sweat, but in the hidden tragedies of those who lived, worked, and died under falling walls. In the end, the promise of safety was always an illusion. One sharp crack in the night, and the fortress became the tomb. Wells were poisoned by enemies and sometimes servants. In the silent heart of every medieval castle, past the thick walls and winding staircases, there lay a well, a lifeline, hidden deep beneath the earth, protected with iron grates and guarded by loyal men. Water was everything. A castle could withstand sieges for months if its well remained pure. But if that water was tainted, all the stone and steel in the world could not save those trapped inside. The castle well was both sanctuary and Achilles' heel, a secret vulnerable to the most insidious kind of warfare. Throughout history, the poisoning of wells became a nightmare that haunted every noble household and fortified town. During times of siege or rebellion, when armies surrounded castles and starved defenders into desperation, enemies knew that victory often hinged on what the garrison drank. With a few secretive acts, a handful of deadly herbs, a pinch of ground mineral, or a decomposing animal dropped under cover of night, a single saboteur could unleash chaos. Sometimes it was the work of foreign spies, other times bribed servants or desperate locals forced to betray their masters. There was no defense more subtle or more devastating than poison in the water. The effects could be swift and horrifying. Defenders would wake, drink, and soon succumb to agonizing cramps, vomiting, fever, delirium. Some poisons killed within hours. Others weakened their victims just enough to make them useless when the enemy finally stormed the gates. The panic was contagious. Suspicion fell on everyone, from the youngest kitchen maid to the most trusted advisor. Who had access to the well? Whose loyalty could be bought or broken? Even the mere rumor of tainted water could break morale, sending waves of terror through a trapped and thirsty population. The fear of poisoned wells bred a culture of relentless caution. Guards were posted day and night, watching not only for approaching armies, but for anyone within the walls who might slip something into the water. Water was fetched only under supervision and often from multiple sources, each jealously protected and closely inspected. In desperate times, some castles built hidden secondary wells or secret underground channels, so if one supply was poisoned, there might be another, unknown even to many of the residents. But all the precautions in the world could not stop a determined enemy or a desperate traitor. In some infamous cases, entire families and garrisons perished in a single night, their bodies found slumped beside the well, lips stained, faces twisted in agony. The cause might not be discovered for days or ever. Sometimes the poison was rare and untraceable. Sometimes it was simple, like ground arsenic or deadly nightshade mixed into a bucket in the dead of night. Wells, once symbols of safety, became sources of dread. The simple act of drinking became a wager with fate. To those besieged, thirst itself became a weapon, forcing impossible choices: risk the poisoned water or die slowly of dehydration. Some rulers sent trusted men to taste the water before anyone else, but even these human shields could offer no certainty. The poisoner's art was as old as fear itself, and the most successful ones left behind no trace, only bodies and legends. The poisoning of wells was more than just a military tactic. It was psychological warfare. It made people fear the very thing they needed most. It tore apart communities from within as trust evaporated and paranoia took hold. Even after a siege ended, survivors might never again feel safe drawing water from the depths, haunted by memories of invisible death. Today, castle wells stand empty, dark and still beneath ruined towers. But the terror they inspired lingers in the stones, a reminder that, in the struggle for survival, the deadliest threat is often the one you cannot see. Every time water splashed into a wooden bucket, it carried the silent question: who holds the power now, the defender or the one with the poison in their hand? It is a question that echoes across the centuries. In every hidden corner where hope and trust once ran clear, and where the smallest act of betrayal could drown a kingdom. Secret passages were used for murders and escapes. Imagine walking through the silent stone corridors of a medieval castle at midnight. Torches flicker, shadows creep. But beneath your feet, hidden behind ancient walls, under heavy slabs, or inside hollow columns, lies a labyrinth, invisible to almost everyone. These are the secret passages built into the very bones of castles, disguised so perfectly that even trusted servants could walk past them for years without suspecting. They weren't just architectural quirks. They were designed as desperate lifelines, as silent death traps, and sometimes as the stage for the most shocking betrayals in history. Why did lords and ladies demand such features? Because power in the medieval world was never safe. To rule was to be hunted by rivals, envied by kin, and targeted by assassins. To own a castle meant surrounding yourself with stone, steel, and as much paranoia as you could muster. Escape tunnels and hidden stairs promised hope, the possibility that when the knives came out you could vanish before the doors even splintered. But these very passages, so carefully built for protection, often became the channels through which horror entered instead. In England's Warwick Castle, for example, a network of tunnels runs from the heart of the fortress out to the surrounding woods. Local legend says a lord's enemy, denied entry at the main gate, bribed a guard to reveal the tunnel's secret door. That night, a dozen men crept unseen into the lord's bedchamber. By morning, the lord was found stabbed, every entrance locked from within. The killers vanished like mist, no matter how heavily the castle was fortified. No wall could keep out what you had unknowingly let in. And the whispers began: if even the Lord of Warwick could be murdered in a safe room, who among them was ever truly safe? Similar tales haunt the Loire Valley in France. The chateaux there bristle with hidden doors, masked as bookshelves or seamless panels in the wainscoting. Sometimes these passages led to gardens or rivers, offering desperate escape during sieges. But sometimes they led to a darker fate. In 1589, the Duke of Guise, a powerful Catholic noble, was summoned to a private meeting with King Henry III. The Duke entered the king's quarters, trusting the guards at the door. But assassins slipped through a secret door hidden behind a tapestry. By the time the guards broke in, the Duke was dead, killed not by open combat, but by silent conspirators who used the palace's own secrets against its guest. This wasn't just the stuff of isolated legend. Castles across Europe, from Scotland to Bohemia, boasted priest holes, false fireplaces, rotating panels, and trapdoors in the floor. These features weren't just paranoid decorations, they were weapons in the constant game of survival. The same passages that allowed a besieged noble to escape could be used by traitors to sneak in. Servants knew to keep their eyes averted when certain stones were pressed, certain doors opened with keys no one else ever saw. Every locked room, every private meeting held the possibility of invisible witnesses, someone lurking in the walls, listening, waiting for a moment to strike. The psychological effect was enormous. Imagine living each day knowing that the stones themselves might betray you. Trust collapsed. The line between friend and foe blurred. A loyal chamberlain by day might be an assassin by night, slipping away down a stair hidden behind a wardrobe. Many rulers would test their own passages, ordering guards to find them if you can. Sometimes even they forgot all the routes, leading to accidental discoveries decades later. In Scotland's Glamis Castle, workers found a bricked-up chamber in the 19th century, filled with ancient bones and rusted daggers, a silent record of violence that no chronicler ever dared to record. Not all stories ended in murder. Sometimes secret passages offered the only hope of survival. During the English Civil War, Lady Blanche Arundel held Wardour Castle with just 25 defenders against a force of 1,300. As cannon fire battered the gates, she guided her children through a hidden tunnel beneath the keep, spiriting them away to safety as the fortress fell. In Prague, the so-called Defenestration of Prague in 1618, a pivotal moment that sparked the 30 Years' War, was followed by an almost miraculous escape. Catholic regents thrown from a window survived, in part because hidden passages allowed their rescuers to move unseen by angry mobs swarming the castle. But for every successful escape, there were failures and horrors. Secret passages sometimes became traps themselves, the air thick with fear and desperation. If an escape tunnel was discovered, it could be blocked or even filled with smoke to suffocate those within. Some lords, obsessed with their own security, ordered the passage's builders killed or exiled, hoping to keep the knowledge of these routes a perfect secret. Yet nothing remained hidden forever. Servants talked, maps were stolen, and every so often a masked figure would appear in a locked room, a knife in hand, as if conjured by the castle's own nightmares. These events bled into folklore, inspiring countless ghost stories about footsteps echoing from empty halls, doors that open onto impossible darkness, or shadows slipping through the stonework itself. The message was always the same. In a castle, you could never trust that you were truly alone. Your greatest comfort, the promise of safety behind thick walls, could flip into terror at a moment's notice. The design of medieval castles wasn't just about stone and mortar. It was about psychology, fear, and the lengths to which people would go to protect themselves or destroy their enemies. To study the secret passages of history is to glimpse the real, raw edge of medieval power. These weren't just fairy tale features or fanciful movie tropes. They were hard, practical responses to the relentless dangers of a brutal age. The walls could talk, the rooms could move, and the boundaries between safety and betrayal were as thin as a cleverly disguised doorway. Castles rose above the landscape, monuments to strength. But deep inside, beneath the stone and the candlelight, ran veins of secrecy and blood, connecting all who lived and sometimes died within their grasp. Even now, when you visit a ruined fortress or tour a restored chateau, you might wonder what's behind the next wall, under the next step. The echoes are still there. Some secrets, after all, are built to last forever. Rebellious servants turned murderers overnight. Trust was a rare and fragile currency behind the thickest castle walls. Nobles lived surrounded by their own servants, hundreds of men and women whose lives were spent in the shadows of wealth and power, tending to their master's needs, obeying every order, and holding the secrets of their employers close. Yet beneath the surface of duty simmered a volatile mix of resentment, desperation, and ambition. Castles were not just fortresses against outside foes. They were powder kegs, always at risk of erupting from within. And more often than history likes to admit, the deadliest threat to a noble's life was the hand that poured his wine, the feet that crept softly across his chamber floor in the middle of the night. Servants saw everything. They cleaned the lord's clothes, poured his bath, overheard his arguments and ambitions. They watched, silent and unseen, as family feuds flared and fortunes changed. They also bore the brunt of every cruelty and whim. Beaten for small mistakes, left hungry or cold when rations ran thin, cast out at a lord's displeasure with nowhere to go but ruin. Over time, the castle's grandeur became a prison for them, its feasts a daily reminder of their own hunger. Each slight and humiliation planted a seed of bitterness that could bloom in the right conditions into betrayal. Sometimes the spark was desperation, a servant's family starving in the village, a promise broken one time too many, a noble's threats carried just a step too far. Sometimes it was ambition, a bribe from an outside enemy, a whispered promise of gold and freedom. Enemies of the castle knew that every fortress had 1,000 cracks, back doors, forgotten passages, and most importantly, people whose loyalty could be bought or shattered. A single letter smuggled in a quiet conversation in a smoky tavern, and the plot was born. There are chilling chronicles of nobles murdered in their beds, their food poisoned, their defenses undone by the very people they trusted most. A cup of wine laced with deadly herbs, a bedroom window left unlocked for an assassin to slip in, a key borrowed, a knife hidden under a servant's apron, and a moment's opportunity seized with fatal resolve. In some cases, the attacks were wild acts of revenge, a lifetime of abuse paid back in a single, irreversible night. In others, they were meticulously planned conspiracies, the product of weeks or months of secret meetings and coded signals. Betrayal was not always violent. Sometimes it was the slow leaking of secrets to an enemy, a coded message delivered to a rival lord, a gate opened in the dead of night as attackers waited outside. Castles that seemed impenetrable fell not to siege engines, but to a single servant who chose to side with the enemy. Even the most powerful nobles lived in constant suspicion, cycling through staff, demanding loyalty oaths, and keeping the most personal details of their lives as secret as possible. But no amount of caution could stop the thoughts that festered in the minds of the desperate. The aftermath was swift and brutal. If the plot was discovered, punishment was merciless. Servants found guilty of betrayal faced torture, execution, their bodies displayed as a warning to others. Sometimes innocent staff suffered as well, caught up in the backlash of suspicion and rage. But for every plot uncovered, there were others that succeeded. Stories hidden, erased, whispered only in fear. The murdered noble became a legend, the castle changed hands, and life went on, the cycle repeating itself as new faces took up the old roles. In the grand histories of kings and conquests, these betrayals rarely earned more than a footnote. But within the cold, echoing chambers of every castle, the lesson was never forgotten. No wall was high enough, no gate strong enough to protect against the hand that served you your bread. In the end, trust was the most dangerous gamble of all, one that countless lords and ladies lost, not to armies, but to those closest to them, waiting in the shadows with their own stories to tell. Moats could drown you if you slipped or were thrown in. Imagine standing on the edge of a castle's moat, not the pristine storybook ribbon of blue that picture books promise, but a wide churning trench, its waters black with mud, rot, and refuse. It's easy to forget, centuries later, that moats were never just for show. They were weapons, deadly obstacles designed to destroy attackers, yes, but also hazards for anyone unlucky enough to live or work near them. The castle's most beautiful feature was, for many, a nightmare in waiting. One misstep on a slick stone, one careless tumble, and the water would claim you faster than any sword. Moats were the first and often the last line of defense. They surrounded castles, manor houses, and city walls across medieval Europe, presenting an instant barrier to armies and intruders. But their true terror was not always seen from afar. The water was rarely clean. It was a swirling blend of runoff, animal waste, rotting vegetation, and whatever refuse the castle needed to get rid of. The stench hung heavy in the air, sometimes so foul that even the defenders dreaded duty nearby. Moats could freeze in winter or swell with rain, their banks slippery and treacherous year-round. During sieges, moats became fields of horror. Invaders who tried to cross, by boat, by swimming, or by makeshift bridges, often found the water far deeper and more treacherous than expected. The bottom was thick with mud, enough to drag down a man in armor within seconds. Wooden stakes, sometimes hidden just beneath the surface, waited to impale the unwary. Archers and crossbowmen lined the walls, ready to strike at any who hesitated or struggled. For many attackers, the moat was a one-way journey. The only escape was to drown quietly or face a hail of arrows above. But the moat's dangers were not reserved for enemy soldiers. Servants, laborers, and even children who lived within the castle's shadow faced them every day. Many castles had only a single bridge, sometimes nothing more than planks or a drawbridge that could be raised without warning. In rain, the stones became slick with moss. A single step in the wrong place could send someone tumbling down the bank into the water. More than one servant, tasked with hauling supplies or emptying chamber pots, lost their balance and vanished beneath the surface. The panic was immediate. Few could swim, and the water was too cold, too heavy, too filled with debris to allow escape. Some never resurfaced, their bodies found only days later, if at all. Then there were the stories whispered after dark, of prisoners or traitors thrown in as punishment, left to flounder in the dark, filthy waters while the castle watched from above. For them, the moat was not just a barrier, but an execution chamber. Sometimes it was a warning. The message was clear: betray the Lord or break the law, and the moat would be your grave. No heroics, no trial by combat, just the cold embrace of the water and the silence that followed. Records from the Middle Ages describe moats in grim detail. Chroniclers noted how bodies would wash up after a siege, swollen and unrecognizable. In times of plague or famine, the moat was sometimes used to dispose of corpses or diseased animals, only making the waters deadlier. To fall in was to risk infection, poisoning, or a slow, lonely death. The castle's beauty became a deadly illusion, a shimmering surface that hid all manner of secrets beneath. Crossing a moat, even in peace, was a tense affair. Visitors and workers watched their steps on narrow bridges, knowing that a misstep could mean disaster. Children were warned to stay away, but the lure of forbidden water was sometimes too strong. There are tales, half remembered, half true, of lost sons and daughters, their stories ending not in fairy tales but in tragedy. Yet despite all this, the moat was indispensable. It was the ultimate deterrent, a symbol of power and untouchability. Lords and ladies would gaze across the water, comforted by the distance between themselves and the outside world. The reflection of the castle walls shimmered on the surface, masking the reality of what lay beneath. The moat did its job. It protected, but it also punished. It was the price of security, a danger for friend and foe alike. In popular imagination, moats have become picturesque, perfect for swans and summer afternoons. But listen closely to the stories of those who lived in their shadow, and another picture emerges: the fear of nighttime slips, the dread of punishment, the ever-present threat that the water might claim another life. For every festival held in the castle hall, there was a whispered story of someone who vanished beneath the surface, never to return. And so, if you visit a castle today and see the moat glinting under the sun, remember that it was once a boundary not just between attacker and defender, but between life and death. One step too close, and history could swallow you whole. The moat was a silent executioner, a constant peril, and a reminder that in the medieval world, beauty and danger were never far apart. Animals roamed freely and could kill children. Inside the sprawling walls of a medieval castle, Life was wild in ways that modern imagination rarely grasps. Beyond the stone, banners, and echoes of human voices, there was a constant, restless movement of animals, large, powerful, unpredictable. Hunting dogs, mastiffs bred for violence, war horses with nerves tuned for battle. Even captured wild creatures kept as symbols of status or for the thrill of exotic pets. These animals were not confined to distant kennels or stables. They lived alongside people, weaving through courtyards, kitchens, and living chambers, their presence both ordinary and deadly. For noble families, animals were tools, symbols, and sometimes companions, but rarely tamed in the modern sense. Hunting dogs, greyhounds, bloodhounds, and enormous wolfhounds patrolled the halls, trained to chase, to corner, to kill. They could be affectionate with their masters, but to a small child or an unfamiliar servant, they were as dangerous as wolves. Packs of dogs sometimes fought among themselves, breaking into snarling violence that spilled through doorways and into the very rooms where people worked and played. There are chilling records of children dragged from their mother's arms or bitten in the chaos of a kitchen fight. War horses, the pride of every castle, were another peril. These massive spirited animals were bred for aggression, their size and strength essential on the battlefield, but lethal in the close quarters of castle life. A startled war horse could trample a servant, kick out a wall, or send terrified grooms running for safety. Sometimes children would sneak into the stables, drawn by curiosity, and suffer fatal injuries from a single careless move. Even experienced handlers risked broken bones or worse every day. Then there were the wild pets, exotic beasts given as gifts or captured during hunts. Bears, lynxes, wild boars, even small leopards or monkeys sometimes roamed castle grounds, chained but far from truly secure. Nobles delighted in the spectacle, but the reality was far more brutal. These animals escaped, turned on servants, or lashed out unpredictably. To be bitten or mauled was an occupational hazard. The shock and tragedy of a child killed or a servant mauled might draw sympathy, but rarely justice. The animals were too valuable, too symbolic of their owner's power and prestige, for their violence to mean much in the legal order of the castle. Punishments for animal attacks were uncommon. Instead, blame was quietly shifted to the victim for startling the animal or failing to follow orders. Mourning was private and brief. Life moved on, and so did the animals, their teeth and hooves and claws, always waiting for another mistake. Castles were never truly safe spaces. Every resident, child, servant, or even lord lived with a constant low-level awareness that danger was as likely to come from a familiar beast as from an enemy at the gates. For children, the threat was omnipresent. They darted through corridors and courtyards with the reckless energy of youth, but always under the watchful, sometimes hungry eyes of creatures bred for strength and violence. Some grew up learning to keep a wary distance. Others did not survive their first encounter. The stories of maulings and tramplings flickered through castle gossip, warnings whispered by mothers and kitchen maids. Behind the glory of the medieval stronghold, this was the hidden truth. Castles were not just homes or fortresses, but living, breathing ecosystems of danger. Here, stone walls offered no guarantee of safety, and every noble feast or quiet morning could be shattered in an instant by the unpredictable force of an animal's instincts. In a world where power was measured in blood and muscle, even the youngest and most vulnerable were always one heartbeat away from tragedy. Feasts turned deadly from rotten food. Picture a long candle-lit table groaning under the weight of roasted birds, steaming meats, wheels of cheese, and goblets brimming with wine. The air is alive with laughter, music, and the raucous joy of a grand medieval feast. But hidden beneath the merriment is a constant gnawing risk, one that has nothing to do with politics or betrayal. In a world without refrigeration or science, every plate and pitcher is a potential weapon. Rotten food and spoiled drink could turn a night of celebration into a scene of terror and despair. killing not just a single rival, but dozens of unsuspecting guests. The truth was simple and inescapable. In the Middle Ages, food safety was a gamble, and the odds were never in anyone's favor. Livestock were slaughtered and meat hung in open air, vulnerable to flies, mold, and the unpredictable swing of the seasons. Fish and game sometimes traveled for days or weeks before reaching the castle kitchens, packed in salt or barrels, but far from truly safe. Even the noblest kitchens were crowded, chaotic places, where food might sit for hours in the heat, and servants often lacked the time or knowledge to tell the difference between fresh and fatal. Wine and ale were no safer. Stored in wooden barrels that warped and leaked, these drinks could turn sour or moldy overnight, especially when mixed with water from questionable wells. The telltale signs, strange smells, a bitter taste, were sometimes masked by the heavy spices and honey that cooks used to cover the flavor of meat already on the edge of decay. Dishes might be laced with ginger, cloves, or garlic, not for luxury, but to hide what should never have been served. It was a risk everyone accepted, because feasts were essential to power. They were the currency of alliances, celebrations, and diplomacy. But when spoiled food slipped past the bustling staff and into the mouths of the lords, ladies, and servants, disaster could unfold with terrifying speed. Within hours, a hall might echo not with laughter, but with the cries of agony. Guests doubled over, vomiting, feverish, racked by pain no one understood. Sometimes the youngest and weakest would die first. Other times dozens could be struck down in a single night, the joy of the feast replaced by mourning and confusion. No one was safe from the invisible threat. Even kings and queens who surrounded themselves with tasters and physicians were vulnerable. The science of germs was centuries away, and cures often made things worse. Rumors flew. Was it poison or just bad luck? Whispers of curses, rival plots, and angry spirits mixed with the very real and terrifying knowledge that tomorrow's meal could be just as dangerous as today's. The aftermath was grim. Castles fell silent, corridors haunted by the moans of the sick. Survivors faced days of weakness, dehydration, and the possibility of lifelong damage, while those who died were buried with haste, fueling more stories of haunted banquets and feasts cursed by fate. The fear lingered long after the tables were cleared, a shadow on every future celebration. Out of necessity, elaborate rituals grew around food. Inspectors sniffed and tasted, dishes were sent back and forth from kitchen to table, and servants were quietly dismissed if too many fell ill. But all these measures could only reduce, not eliminate, the risk. In the end, the only true defense was luck, and the willingness to keep feasting despite the danger. Every banquet was a test of courage, a celebration held in defiance of an enemy that no sword could slay. Today we remember medieval feasts as grand and glorious spectacles, full of abundance and excess. But behind every toast, every song, every bite was a reminder that joy and death sat side by side at the table. In the flickering candlelight, as shadows stretched across faces flushed with wine, there was always the silent question: would this be the night when the feast itself became the killer? The echoes of those deadly celebrations live on in ruined halls and empty kitchens, a warning that even the simplest pleasures can turn dangerous when fate, hunger, and human error combine. In a world ruled by uncertainty, every feast was a triumph, not just of wealth, but of survival. Castle collapses killed entire noble families. Overnight. It's midnight in a medieval world where the very walls that promise safety can turn to stone coffins with no warning. You imagine a castle, its silhouette black against a storm-lashed sky, torches flickering, wind howling through arrow slits. Inside, nobles feast, children dream, guards pace the battlements, and servants steal a few precious moments of rest. But outside, the rain seeps into the mortar, or a tremor shakes the earth, or centuries of hidden rot finally reach their breaking point. Suddenly, everything changes. The ground shudders. There's a crack, a groan that sounds almost alive, and then the unimaginable happens. The entire castle collapses. Stone upon stone, roof upon bedchamber, towers tumbling inward in a nightmare avalanche that erases every sign of life within seconds. This wasn't just the stuff of old legends or poetic exaggeration. The reality of castle collapses is written in the margins of medieval chronicles, carved into the ruins that dot the European countryside. Some castles were miracles of engineering, yes, but many more were desperate improvisations, rushed by ambition, damaged by siege, undermined by water or time, and kept standing by sheer habit rather than true strength. When they failed, the consequences were absolute. Imagine the horror of the night of 1287 at Burchard Castle in Saxony. The noble family of von Burchard went to sleep as lords of their domain. In the darkest hours before dawn, their castle, already weakened by a month of relentless rain, simply gave way. The main tower split, the walls crashed inward, and stone roofs pancaked down, one after another. By morning, the entire family and dozens of servants were buried alive, their cries muffled under tons of rubble. There were no survivors, only a heap of stone and a sudden, total silence where once power and laughter reigned. It happened again and again. Sometimes the cause was shoddy workmanship. An over-ambitious lord demanded his keep rise faster than the builder's skill could allow, or a new wing was slapped onto an old foundation that couldn't bear the weight. Medieval masons didn't have blueprints or building codes. They worked from memory, improvising with whatever materials they had. If the wrong sand was mixed in the mortar, if a support beam was cut too thin, disaster was only a matter of time. Nature was a relentless adversary. A castle might stand proudly for decades, then fall in a single night when lightning struck a watchtower and set fire to the roof. The flames would race along the wooden supports, the stones would crack and split in the sudden heat, and whole sections of the fortress could collapse before anyone even knew what was happening. Or worse, an earthquake, rare but not unknown in medieval Europe, could bring down the proudest stronghold in minutes. The earthquake of 1117 in northern Italy toppled the keep of Verona, killing everyone inside, including the entire Della Scala family, rulers whose line vanished in a single night of chaos. Sometimes the very rivers that gave castles life betrayed them. Castles were often built by water for defense and supply, but rivers shifted course or flooded after storms, eating away at the foundations, loosening stones. One spring night in 1342, the castle of the Counts of Blankenheim collapsed after weeks of flooding. The entire household was crushed as the great hall caved in, generations wiped away in seconds. Chroniclers describe the aftermath as a stone tomb for the living, a scene of despair where rescue was impossible and mourning turned into resignation. It wasn't just the great and powerful who perished. Servants and workers often lived in the most dangerous sections. Underground kitchens, storage vaults, drafty towers patched and repaired too many times. When a castle collapsed, it rarely gave warning. Maybe a stone or two fell from a ceiling. Maybe there was a tremor, a subtle shift. But more often the only sign was the sound of death itself. A roar of cracking rock, the crash of timbers, and then dust, darkness, and silence. These collapses reshaped history. A noble house could vanish overnight, its rivals seizing lands, its memory preserved only in whispered stories. Children orphaned by the collapse of their ancestral home might spend their lives in monasteries, haunted by the sound of falling stone. Villagers nearby told tales of curses, of omens ignored, a flock of crows circling the tower, a strange chill before the collapse. But the truth was often simpler and more brutal. Medieval castles were both fortresses and traps, shelters and tombs, built by human hands in an age where nature and time cared nothing for dreams of power. Some ruins still bear the scars. Walls split and tumbled, towers half sunk in earth, stones scattered like bones. Archaeologists, centuries later, dig through the rubble and find beds turned to cages, skeletons still huddled together where families tried to protect one another in those final moments. The story never changes. The promise of safety shattered by the betrayal of the very walls that were supposed to defend. These tragedies left a deep mark on the medieval mind. They became parables about pride, about the illusion of control, about how the pursuit of power can end in sudden, meaningless loss. They fueled superstitions about haunted ruins, about noble ghosts wandering the rubble, mourning the homes that killed them. In some places, no one dared rebuild. A collapsed castle was a warning from fate itself. But most of all, these disasters reveal the fragile line between security and disaster in a world ruled by stone, sweat, and fear. Castles were built to be eternal. But their collapse proved, in the most brutal way, that nothing built by humans is ever truly safe. One moment you are a lord or a lady, sleeping under the roof of your mighty fortress. The next, you are dust and legend, your story lost beneath the stones that once bore your name.